Tonight on Ukraine Today, how many millions of Russians is Putin ready to kill? Enemy losses, the battlefield situation and partisan resistance. Russian offensive. Troops captured 4 villages in the Sumy region and advanced in Kharkiv and Donetsk regions. Republicans push to tougher action on Russia. What did Senator Chuck Grassley demand from President Donald Trump? The EU keeps paying Russia. According to Bild, Europe sends more money to Moscow than it spends on helping Ukraine. All that and more on Ukraine Today. Hi there, we're from Ukraine. My name is Volodymyr Lopchun. Click like, subscribe, and let's begin. In the past 24 hours, Russia lost at least 990 soldiers, killed and wounded. Since the start of the full-scale invasion, that's already 982,840 troops. We're getting close to the first million. Also, in just one day, Ukraine's defense forces destroyed 2 Russian tanks, 1 armored vehicles, 17 artillery systems, and dozens more pieces of Russian military hardware. Ukrainian troops hit Russian positions in the Kursk region using FPV drones. As a result, the Russians lost 2 all-terrain vehicles they were using to cross the border, plus 1 shelter with enemy personnel. Meanwhile, Ukrainian partisans sabotaged weapons supply for the Russian army. In the Tula region, they took down a relay cabinet on a key railway line. The result, military trains came to a stop. Now to the front lines. Russian troops advanced in the Sumy region, capturing 4 villages. All civilians had been evacuated earlier. There is also movement on the Kharkiv and Donetsk fronts. Russia is boosting drone production. What used to take a month, they now produce in just 3 days. That's why we're seeing more and more mass drone attacks on Ukrainian cities. More on that in our report.
For 3 days in a row, Russia carried out massive missile and drone attacks on Ukraine. Every night, the aggressor launched at least 300 UAVs as well as dozens of missiles, thereby setting new negative records. Russia unleashed hellfire on Ukraine. This was the headline under which The Economist published an article about the 3 days of terror. The British publication writes that the number of missiles used in Russian attacks has increased several times over.
A year ago, 30 drones striking Ukraine in a single night were considered exceptional. Now Russia is saturating Ukraine's air defenses with hundreds of such drones. If the current ceasefire negotiations fail, which seems quite likely, air defense units will have to ration their interceptors. More Russian missiles and drones will break through to strike cities, towns, and critical industries.
The enemy, given that Allied support has noticeably decreased, is now clearly making a concerted effort to put pressure on the air defense system and force us to deplete it, thereby leaving our cities exposed.
Russia is actively ramping up production of Shahed-type attack drones, and the past 3 days are proof of that. The article claims that such massive attacks could become constant. With these strikes, the Kremlin wants to bleed Ukraine's air defense dry and show that negotiations will only take place on the aggressor's terms.
Last year, the Kremlin was producing about 300 Shahed drones per month. The same number is now produced in less than 3 days. Ukrainian military intelligence claims to have documents indicating that Russia plans to increase drone production to 500 per day, which suggests that swarm attacks of up to 1,000 drones could become a reality.
Perhaps Russia has indeed started producing many more Shaheds, but constant massive attacks are an expensive undertaking. Shaheds cost a lot of money, especially when they're launched by the hundreds. However, the effectiveness of such attacks is not very high. At best, only 5% of the launched Shaheds manage to break through the defenses.
The enemy cannot carry out such strikes indefinitely. This involves both production and the expenditure of resources.
Shaheds are not cheap. They cost up to $200,000 if we're talking about the Shahed 136.
It all depends on financial resources. The aggressor state's economy should experience unpleasant consequences as a result. Then Russia will not be able to use such large quantities. For 3 days in a row, Russia really did allocate significant financial resources.
The article also claims that the Shaheds have undergone significant upgrades to their control systems, and this will create major problems for Ukrainian air defense.
The latest models are not afraid of Ukrainian electronic warfare. That's because they no longer rely on jam-resistant GPS, are controlled by artificial intelligence, and use Ukraine's own internet and mobile networks. The team says that they recently found a note inside one of the drones they were dismantling, supposedly left by a sympathetic Russian engineer, which hinted at a new control algorithm. According to the note, the drones are controlled using bots on the Telegram social media platform, which send flight data and live video feeds to human operators in real time.
A specialist in military radio technology and active duty serviceman Sergei, call sign Flash Beskrestov, also questioned this part of the British publication. Flash is convinced that at present all of this is impossible.
Shahed drones are not controlled via Telegram and are not equipped with artificial intelligence, contrary to what The Economist reported. UAVs still use satellite navigation signals, and Ukrainian specialists have not found any notes describing new control systems inside downed drones. Shaheds can indeed be equipped with SIM cards, not necessarily Ukrainian ones, but route tracking is carried out using trackers installed on the drones.
Whether massive attacks on Ukraine will continue and how much the Shaheds have been modernized, only time will tell. The key is to strengthen sanctions against the aggressor country and provide Ukraine with more air defense systems and missiles for them, since Russia is engaged in the mass destruction of Ukrainians.
Last night, the Ukrainian air defense shot down 43 out of 60 enemy drones. 35 were destroyed and 8 were jammed or lost location. No, this wasn't as massive as the past 3 nights, but it shows the Kremlin still refuses any ceasefire. They want more war, not peace.
We can see from our intelligence and from open sources, Putin and his circle are not planning to end this war. There's no real sign that they're even considering peace or serious diplomacy. On the contrary, there's plenty of evidence they're preparing new offensive operations. Russia is counting on a long war, and that means they openly disrespect everyone in the world who wants peace and who's trying to make diplomacy work. I'm sure our partners' intelligence services also see the same facts. The key thing now is not to look away and to report this to the top. What we really need now is one thing: honest conclusions and united pressure on Russia.
In the US, Republican Senator Chuck Grassley called on President Trump to take action against Putin. He wrote on X, "I've had enough of Putin killing innocent people. President Trump, take action, at least sanctions." At the same time, the Wall Street Journal reports that President Trump may increase sanctions on Russia this week. Why? Because of his growing frustration with Putin, who keeps ignoring ceasefire talks. And what is Russia doing instead? Stalling. Moscow claims to be drafting a peace memorandum.
Russia is still working on a draft memorandum about a possible future peace agreement. It would include things like settlement principles, possible timelines, and a potential temporary ceasefire, but only if certain agreements are reached. Once the draft is ready, and I want to mention that Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov comments on this almost daily, it will be sent to Kyiv. We expect that the Ukrainian side is doing the same and will send us their proposals as soon as they receive the Russian document.
Sure, Maria, you want peace? Start by stopping the fire and get out of Ukraine. They say they're preparing a document. Anyone here believe that so-called memorandum will include anything realistic? Drop a comment below. I'm guessing it's just another piece of paper demanding Ukrainian surrender. Ukraine is fighting for freedom. Support independent Ukrainian journalism so we can keep showing you the truth about this war. Click the link in the description to become our sponsor. Together to victory. Also, click like and subscribe. Thank you. Meanwhile, Russia is testing a satellite communication system that might one day rival Starlink, the system used by Ukrainian forces on the battlefield.
At first, the Kremlin dreamed of using lasers to shoot down Starlink satellites, and now they're dreaming of copying them.
we have the capability to be better.
In Russia, they are planning to create their own satellite internet system, which is supposed to be a kind of analog to the American Starlink.
First and foremost, it's very important that Staratskis and the Prime Minister have supported the national project. Now we can bring it before the Presidential Council for Strategic Development of National Projects.
The RASVED project involves the launch of a low-orbit satellite system, promising broadband internet and improved navigation. At Bureau 1044, they claim that the accuracy of GLONASS navigation when controlling drones will supposedly increase to 2.5 meters and the data transfer speed to 1 gigabit per second. By the end of 2027, the aggressor country plans to launch 292 satellites into orbit, and by 2030, a total of 383.
Another matter is whether it is actually possible for Russia to launch that many satellites by 2031. For example, in 2024, the United States launched 2,249 spacecraft, including 1,141 Starlink satellites. As of today, the Starlink satellite constellation already exceeds 8,000 satellites. Russia, on the other hand, launched 95 spacecraft of various types in 2024. And even despite such a colossal gap with the United States, it seems that launching 338 satellites over 5 years is, in principle, something they could handle. But this immediately raises the question of whether they have the technological capacity to manufacture such a volume of finished products.
The Russians will place their system at an altitude of 800 kilometers. Its creators insist that this is the optimal balance between the number of satellites, energy consumption, and the project's economics. This is supposedly the main difference from Starlink, which operates at an altitude of 500 kilometers, but thanks to a larger number of satellites, provides higher capacity and data transmission for millions of users around the world.
The tasks are quite resource-intensive. According to experts, to accomplish them over the next 3-year period, more than 1 trillion rubles in total will need to be allocated. Looking ahead, by 2036, about 4.5 trillion rubles will be required.
But the main source of pride for the developers of RASVED, as they claim, is complete technological independence from the West. In every statement, propagandists loudly proclaim that the ground stations and satellites will be assembled exclusively from Russian-made radio-electronic components. But after 3 years of sanctions, the exodus of foreign suppliers, and a chronic shortage of import substitution, such assurances are believed only by those who make them. Even Russian officials themselves admit, so far they have not managed to achieve a closed production cycle in any sector.
Moscow does not have the technological capability to independently implement such a global project without Western technologies. And the test devices launched in 2023 were assembled using microelectronic components that were subject to large-scale sanctions against Russia in 2022. In fact, as of 2025, it is not possible to speak of any analog to the American global satellite system, and it is quite possible that the project itself will simply sink into the swamp of Russia's technological backwardness, heavily seasoned with corruption and internal elite infighting.
This is far from the first project by the great and powerful that was supposed to surpass Starlink, but ended up failing. Yes, the numbers are ambitious, but the reality is still far from the statements. In 2024, Roscosmos carried out only 17 launches, fewer than in the previous 2 years. At the same time, the US reached 145 launches and China 68. As of today, the satellite internet market is essentially divided between two players, Starlink from the US and the European OneWeb. But in terms of technology, Starlink is not just ahead, it's on a different level. Developed by SpaceX, this project has, since 2015, become a tool of geopolitics and modern warfare, serving as a lifeline for armies, refugees, remote regions, and the civilian sector. As of March 2025, there are already more than 7,000 Starlink satellites in orbit. In May alone, SpaceX launched another 23. The constellation will grow to 12,000 units and then to 30,000. The total project budget is around $10 billion. And with this kind of background in complete isolation, Moscow is trying to replicate the success. Whether the Russians will manage to achieve anything at all without access to Western technologies remains to be seen. However, given the half-dead state of the Occupiers' tech sector after the sanctions were imposed, all they can really hope for is yet another round of mock-ups.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine today. Join us now.
And now to Germany. Berlin is getting ready for potential conflict with Russia. The chief of defense has issued a directive to fully rearm the Bundeswehr with modern weapons by 2029. The focus: expanding Germany's defense and offensive capabilities as quickly as possible. Why? Because of the growing threat from Russia. Details right now.
Germany is preparing for war. That's exactly the warning coming from the Inspector General of the German Armed Forces. General Carsten Breuer stated that Russia could attack one of the NATO countries as early as 2029.
Stories like this, where they say that by 2029 the Russian Federation might attack, we just don't know. It could be 2029, it could be 2028, or maybe 2038, or even 2148, we just don't know. For Western European countries, where bureaucracy is highly developed, and they admit this themselves, for example, Germany, where everything is extremely bureaucratized, they need a lot of precise time in order to ramp up any sector of the economy.
The German command believes that Russia can restore the combat capability of its army within a few years, despite its losses in Ukraine. In addition to increasing its numbers, Moscow is actively developing industries related to the production of weapons.
Yes, the Russian Federation doesn't have the resources it had in 2022, not even close, but what would stop the Russian Federation from regaining some strength over a year or two and, say, using 10,000 of its soldiers to try to occupy the Estonian city of Narva, occupy it and then claim it wasn't them, just like usual, like what happened in Donetsk?
But hold on, we've already heard about the main goals of the so-called special military operation from Putin's parrots.
The complete fulfillment of the goals of this special military operation is the creation of a single union state. Russia, Ukraine and Belarus, the restoration of the Russian world within its natural borders.
Resources aside, does the Kremlin actually have the desire to attack NATO countries at this point in time?
Look, they need a war. It doesn't matter where, it doesn't matter what kind. Ideally, it should be small, victorious, swift, and very, very grandiose. Because the war in Ukraine has dragged on. No matter how you spin it, even Russian propaganda can't present the capture of the village of Bohatyr as something extraordinary. Yes, they brag about it, but it doesn't work. They need something small and quick. It could be anywhere. It could be a NATO country. It could be the annexation of Belarus. It could be the Suwalki corridor. It could be northern Kazakhstan, anything at all.
In Germany itself, they are planning to completely change the structure of the army. The focus is on creating rapid response divisions, improving logistics, protecting critical infrastructure, and strengthening command centers.
They have the money, they have the resources. The main thing for them is to overcome their internal bureaucracy. I know they want to do this, the politicians want it, the military wants it, but society is very indifferent, very indifferent. An acquaintance of mine from Germany came to visit and said, "My God, we're so afraid that if something suddenly happens there, I don't even know who would defend us at all." In other words, the Germans have no desire. There are a huge number of migrants, Turks. Obviously, they're not going to go to war, so for now the focus is on equipment, planes, tanks. They're watching Ukraine's experience.
Meanwhile, the country's defense minister has stated that Germany may reinstate mandatory military conscription.
Our model is initially based on voluntary participation at the outset. But if the time comes when we have more available positions than volunteers, then we may decide to introduce compulsory service.
Be that as it may, Carsten Breuer continues to rely on the United States' loyalty to the alliance, including Donald Trump maintaining cooperation with him in the field of armaments. But can NATO rely on the United States?
Look, they're not counting on them. I know this for a fact, I've spoken with them. They say this, back in March or April, they passed the point of no return. That's exactly what they told me. We have passed the point of no return with the United States of America. Even if, say, this year Trump is replaced and some other president comes in and says, "All right, guys, sorry, that was just a ginger mistake. Let's turn everything back to how it was." To that they say, no, we fully understand that we can no longer count on the US, we are relying on ourselves now.
We shouldn't forget that even though Russia doesn't directly attack NATO in the Baltic Sea, it regularly carries out sabotage.
Don't forget that you can do all sorts of nasty things at sea. For example, blocking ships that are traveling from ports in the Baltic and Scandinavian countries. Block them, don't let them through, just interfere, simply get in the way like hooligans. And how will NATO countries react? No one knows. Most likely they won't react at all.
But it's hard to say whether we can really rely on the US. But NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, commenting on the GUR information, stated that NATO will respond with full force in the event of a Russian attack on one of the alliance countries.
One more thing. Even after 17 rounds of sanctions, the EU keeps paying Russia. According to Bild, European money going to Russia may actually be more than the military aid going to Ukraine. The article says, yes, China, India and Turkey are the biggest buyers of Russian exports, but the EU still pays a huge part. We're talking tens of millions of euros in revenue just from Europe. In total, Russia makes over 200 billion euros from exports. That money fuels Putin's war machine. So the key points of this episode is sanctions and the growing pressure on Russia from both Europe and the United States. Some of that pressure might come as early as this week. We'll be watching closely. That's it for today. Thank you for being with us. We read your comments and feel your support. Strength to Ukraine's defenders. Glory to Ukraine. Subscribe, like, and we'll see you next time.